What if the key to solving the climate crisis isn't just better technology, but rethinking who builds it, how it's funded, and where it's deployed? In this episode of Sustain Now, entrepreneur and carbon removal expert Marian Krüger shares hard-won insights from the front lines of climate innovation. From his early career in green energy and AI-powered solar diagnostics to co-founding Remove, a nonprofit accelerator supporting the next generation of carbon removal startups, Marian unpacks what it really takes to scale solutions in a fragmented, high-risk, high-impact space. This conversation goes far beyond carbon capture. It's a dense, wide-angle look at the state of the climate tech ecosystem, how startups survive in a cooling investment climate, the challenges of building in the global south, and why policy, not just passion, will shape the future of net zero. If you've also been bitten by the climate bug, this episode delivers clarity, strategy, and a hefty dose of conviction. Happy listening.
Marian, welcome to Sustain Now. I'm very excited to have you here. I'm actually not so sure what we should talk about. We have two shared passions, climate tech or techno.
Well, I came appropriately dressed in black, so if you want to turn this into a rave, I'm happy to.
Yeah, me too, almost. I thought black, Berlin style. Are you actually from Berlin?
I am not. I'm from a rather small town in the middle of Germany that probably not a lot of people know, but I've lived in Berlin and I've had my fair share of the techno experience as well.
Nice. Could you bring any inspiration from electronic music to your business right now?
Good question. What I like about electronic music is what I think some people find repetitive and boring is the fact that it can get you into like a flow state while you dance. And I try to maybe have that in my work as well. I am lucky enough to be able to deep dive into topics and then just spend hours researching, and a lot of times I listen to techno on the side because I then can get into that flow state. So maybe that's something.
Yeah, I really like that. I'm actually the same. Like when I work in doing emails, and I have to be careful what kind of techno I'm listening to because they can be quite aggressive sometimes. But I totally agree, and I think I really like the analogy of having like this rhythm of continuously, and I agree, like techno for me is nothing monotone, is really inspiring and can be having a lot of different stages. And it's something which evolved as well over the last 20, 30 years. And if you think about carbon removal, if you look back, like in the last, if you zoom out, who was Marian Krüger before creating a carbon removal accelerator beside being in techno clubs?
I guess I grew up in a family that was not necessarily entrepreneurial, so I wasn't destined to become an impact entrepreneur. My dad was a teacher, but he also was a professional basketball coach. My mom played basketball as well, so did my two brothers. So basketball is sort of how my lens onto how I understood life and the world. A lot of things that I now realize how I look at the world come from there, right? The value of teamwork, the attention to detail, the planning, the strategizing, all that sort of comes from basketball. So I think that was my main identity for quite a while. Quite a lot of my teammates from back then actually turned pro, and some of them are still pro. I didn't, and I'm actually quite glad I didn't. I'm very, very grateful for the time and for what basketball has given me, but I'm also very happy that now my life is not as monothematic as it might have been back then, and that I get to really experience the diversity of life, both in my job and beyond. And sometimes that includes techno, but it can also include a lot of different genres and a lot of other things.
When did you start at basketball?
Basketball. I guess my first experience is probably my parents would say like when I was 2 or 3, I was on the mats in the school gyms that my mom was playing in or that my dad was playing in. And I joined playing as a team probably 7 or 8 and then played continuously. It was really the defining element in my youth. I was lucky enough to play in the team that competed for German championships in front of thousands of people. So that was really a very striking experience that has stuck with me since.
Do you remember like a point then, like maybe in teenage or whenever year, when you decided to stop that and dedicate more time? You know, also dedicated in your studying that time. I think it was behavioral. What you studied. Like, is there anything what you think like, okay, there was a tipping point or a point you remember that, okay, I have to go into the impact space, or I have to find more about behavioral change, which in the end is actually impact?
I don't have like the origin story that some people in climate have, where they can look back and say, oh, with 3, I was, at the ocean. I remember, there was pollution in the ocean, and that has stuck with me ever since. I don't have that. I can remember very, very fondly how I did spend time at the ocean, but those were really fond memories, and I wasn't aware of all the pollution that was already happening back then. I think for me, the critical moment was I just happened to get my first job in climate. And I fell in love with it from the moment I was in. From that point, it was very clear there's no path that doesn't include impact for me. So I really didn't look back after that. I guess you could say with the studies in behavioral economics, that was maybe not necessarily climate, but more impact focused, because you also ask yourself, how can we sustainably change behavior, ideally to the better? And what better is, I guess that is up for definition. You can also use those tools to get people to consume more, and that is not necessarily sustainable in the narrower sense. But I think the general impetus for that was an interest in, you might say impact.
What made you fall in love then into climate in the first job? What was your first job, and what made you fall in love?
I joined a green utility called Energy. Some people who might have been around in the 2010s in the energy space might remember. It was a carve-out out of RWE, and I was there in venture building. And that was, I think, the sweet spot why I fell in love with it, because it was, on the one hand, it was climate, and the people that have an innate interest in climate and impact, and it was the exciting, fast-moving world of entrepreneurship. If I had joined in another role, I'm not sure whether that love would have been sparked in the same way that it has, because of this intersection, I think, of entrepreneurship and climate. And we were validating, or mostly invalidating, potential business models, and that was quite eye-opening. It was diverse, which is a value that I appreciate a lot. It was about exploration, which I also appreciate. So probably I just got lucky to really have a first job that was amazing.
When was that? Which year?
This was 2015.
2015. Yeah. Okay. It was just before actually the real next wave came, right? And then from that company, did you then decide from that, as you said, you experienced a lot of vast different experience in that, did that make you found the next company, the drone-based photovoltaic diagnostic company? It was a very different world. It's a word. I was like, wow, I think it's called UCare.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit more what has been the reason why you founded it in the first place, and what has been your journey through that?
Yeah, so interestingly, UCare started off as a project when I was still at Energy. So it was one of the ideas we validated, and it was then the first company ever to be, well, you can say, spun out of Energy. So my co-founder and I, we were the first employees of Energy to go out and to then start the company. So what UCare did, we inspected large solar PV parks with drones and had what we back then called AI. To be honest, it was more of a basic image recognition algorithm.
It's always good to call afterwards. It was an AI-based startup.
Exactly.
We
right
were
now
very
that helps,
early.
right?
We were very early.
My credentials are definitely what help right now. So we then had an image recognition algorithm.
You should actually add that to that extremely long word. So AI drone-based photovoltaic diagnostic company.
So I could go out and probably raise a lot of money with that right now. Back then, the AI hadn't arrived yet. It was more, we were in the crypto times. But we were inspecting these large parks to find errors or malfunctions in those 40,000 modules that you can imagine are there in such a park, right? And before, so of our solution, they'd have individual persons go with a handheld camera to check every of those 40,000 modules. Now you can imagine how ineffective that is. Now we had the drone pilots that were spread all over Europe working as contractors. So it was the asset-light Uber kind of business model. And they collected these images, and we then had the AI in the background to analyze the data and then tell you as an asset owner, out of your modules, these 500 are malfunctioning. This is what you need to do to increase yield. It was, there clearly was a problem, and we had found a solution that worked. The problem was, I think, that the problem wasn't strong enough yet to be, to put it bluntly, I think the modules were in too good of a shape, right? And I think what stuck with me is this idea, we were kind of providing a vitamin and we weren't a painkiller yet because the pain wasn't strong enough. So that it still led to us venturing into a variety of European markets. We were in Italy, in Spain, in the UK, in some Eastern European countries. It never had the absolute hockey curve yet. I think the company that eventually ended up acquiring us, they're doing very well right now because they stuck with it and they managed to, I think, now profit from the fact that the problem is a much bigger one than it used to be.
What have you learned from that exit?
Well, I sometimes struggle to call it a big exit, right? Because exit already puts something in mind where it's like multi-million-dollar IPO or something.
Come on, you need to tell yourself, I'm a serial entrepreneur. It's a
serial entrepreneur with an AI company that I exited. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no. Let's be humbled here.
Let's be humble, and I really am. Like, I think I'm very happy with the outcome because it meant that our vision and our product continued to live on. All the employees continued to work on this problem, and they found a good home in the company that acquired us. The learning was, I think, we had the strategic investor in very, very early, essentially from the start. And that comes with positive sides, but it also comes with disadvantages. And I think it's something that in our current work with startups, I am always very cautious to suggest to get strategics in too early. Because there is a place and time for them to come in. It might not be pre-seed or seed because they have other priorities than the startups have in those early times of a startup. So I think that's a learning that I took for myself. If in the future I found again, that is probably something that I would do differently.
And let's now, like, what was that? 2017 you started at?
We founded the company in 2016. Yeah.
2016?
Yeah, and then the exit was in 2020.
Okay. What made you then going into CDR afterwards?
So there was first of all, it was impact. Like after that, I was clear I wanted to work on impact even closer, even more directly. Like if I think of the impact chain, obviously solar PV is great because it produces energy cheaper and at a lower cost than fossil fuel based energies, but we didn't directly help those, or we didn't directly create energy, obviously, or generate energy. We helped those assets perform well, thus less CO2 in the air, thus the impact was sort of indirect. And I want to have more direct impact on CO2. And that's why I ended up then joining ETH Zurich, the research university some of your listeners and viewers might know. Not in any academic role, that's definitely not my pedigree, but they have this interesting unit which is called Sustainability and Business Lab, which is more like a think tank or even a consultancy that consults this government and industry players on decarbonization. And I was leading their work on decarbonization. And we were working with waste-to-energy plants in Switzerland. There's about 30 of them in Switzerland. And the only way to really decarbonize them was to do carbon capture and then store the CO2. So we did some feasibility studies on that, and we then also realized, okay, actually 50% of the waste that is being burned is biogenic, i.e. at some point it's taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's your household garbage, it's the thinnings from the forests. And if we then make sure that those CO2 emissions don't end up in the atmosphere again, that is different than if we burn fossil CO2 that we've extracted.
Like plastic.
Like plastics, exactly. So that was a complete eye-opener for me, that there is such a thing as negative emissions, as carbon dioxide removal. And then you look at the IPCC reports and you realize, hell, we need like a hell lot of that. 5 to 10 gigatons in 2050. That's no small feat. And then you look around and you ask yourself, okay, where's that supposed to come from? And back then, this was like early 2020, 2021, there was Climeworks. There were a few other companies in the US, and that was about it. They were active on kilograms to tons. And you're looking at yourself and you think, okay, we have 30 years to get to billions of tons. In an industry that doesn't exist yet, this needs a supporting ecosystem. This will be a startup business, and these startups will need support. So this then led us to say, okay, how about we create this enabling ecosystem? And this was essentially what led us to then found what is now Remove, an accelerator program for carbon removal startups.
Amazing. Before we dive into actually what you're doing, maybe to take a step back and think about, can you explain what CDR really encompass?
Yeah, fundamentally what CDR is, and then the term negative emissions already puts it quite well, right? It is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere that's already there and storing it out of the atmosphere in a way that it doesn't return back to the atmosphere, ideally as long as possible. So if we think of the carbon balance, there is a one emission in the atmosphere, you make sure it ends up being -1. So that's then the negative emission. And there are a variety of ways to do that. The most obvious one that I think also a lot of people think about immediately is about tree planting or having trees, because tree, in their process of photosynthesis, they consume CO2 and then they store it in their trunks or in their leaves. Problem with some of these efforts is if a wildfire comes or if the bark beetle infects a forest, that CO2 can be re-emitted quite quickly again. That's why there's also other options to do the same. There are hybrid methods. There's a variety of ways to classify it, but there are ways that you essentially take natural processes that occur by itself or by themselves, and you speed them up. One of them is called weathering, for instance, right, where you take material that is alkaline that then reacts with the CO2 in the atmosphere by having the rain it's becomes slightly acidic when it comes down because it takes up CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then it reacts with the alkaline mineral to form what is known as bicarbonates. Those end up in the ocean, and in the ocean they're then calcified and stay there for millennia. So that is another way. There's ways to enhance that by crushing those rocks very, very thinly so that the surface area of those rocks is larger. Because you can imagine if you have the Alps, right? That's a large rock. Those also weather, but there's very little surface area compared to if you took all the volume that the Alps have and you ground them very, very thinly and you spread them out, for instance, on agriculture fields. So that is one option. And then there's something which I've mentioned, Climeworks. Some might know that name. It's called direct air capture. So you build large, you can imagine them as fans that have a material inside that selectively reacts to CO2. So you draw in a lot of air, it reacts to CO2 and it's stuck to this chemical, and then through a variety of processes you make sure that that CO2 is extracted from that material, and then you put it on the ground, for instance in oil fields that are vacant.
So you can actually summarize it, what I've been reading about. First of all, I think there's two different ways. One is the actual carbon capture, and then it's the storage part.
Yeah.
And the carbon capture, as you said, there's the nature-based solutions, and then there's technology, like nature-based, what you just said about the trees, etc. And then it's about the technology, which is, for example, Climeworks with the direct air capture. And then you have this hybrid versions. What's for you the most promising one?
This is as if you asked a parent which of their childs they like most, right? You, of course, like all of them alike.
You maybe don't tell, but you have one.
Okay, so we'll definitely show that to...
I only have one child.
Oh, okay, well, that's an easy one. That's an easy one. No, of course, in the end, we will need a portfolio. So if we come back to the amounts of carbon removal we'll need, 5 to 10 gigatons, there is no way in the world that only one method, only one pathway will get us there, right? It will need to be a combination of some. And all of them have benefits and drawbacks. Direct air capture, for instance, can be, because it is a technological innovation, we can very easily think about how it can be scaled, and it can more or less be located anywhere. It needs renewable energy, it needs a storage site, but you can do that, and it's quite, if you want, space efficient. At the same time, it's quite costly, and it
needs a lot of energy.
Exactly, it needs a lot of energy, and it shouldn't displace any other energy, especially renewable energy. If you think about enhanced weathering, what we talked about, grinding up these rocks. Now, this potentially is very scalable, and it could come to a point where it's quite cheap. Problem is, there's still quite a lot of scientific uncertainties
about the measurement.
Exactly, because in the end, it's great that this happens, but in our current paradigm, we also need to have shown that it happens, especially if we use that climate benefit to compensate for an emission that we still have that we cannot get rid of, right? So that might give you an idea. And then all the nature-based solutions, that term I actually have a bit of a problem with because it comes sometimes negatively laden or connotated. Let's call them nature restoration, right? They have loads of co-benefits on biodiversity, on, if you think of stuff like regenerative agriculture. I know you've had a founder on your podcast lately that spoke about regenerative agriculture. Now, it can lead to actual yield increases, right, of significant sizes. It thus can have positive impacts on economic resiliency of smallholder farmers, especially in the Global South, right? So I didn't answer your question directly, but yeah, it's very hard to give a concrete answer because we need all of them.
But if we think about the next, as you said, like 30 years, which we have till 2050, where we want to all be net zero, if we need to place bets, like let's say you want to place 2 bets, where would you place the bet on to really achieve it? Of course, it's afterwards, it's a lot of technology enhancements and etc. But if we would say we need to invest quite a lot of money to actually get there, what would be your 2 bets?
In carbon removal.
In carbon removal.
I think I'm going to chicken out again by saying I'll put my bets on geographies, and the main geography that I will put a lot of my my resources in is the Global South, because for a number of reasons. For one, there's massive potential for carbon removal in those geographies. India alone has, just if you think about biochar, which is one carbon removal method, and in this enhanced weathering, about 1 gigaton. So 1/10 of the 10 that we might need in 2050. That's a potential that just India itself has, according to some scientific studies. Second, those are the communities and geographies that are impacted most by climate change and have had the least impact on it. So putting them in a position that is not only adaptation, i.e. we need to make sure that we protect ourselves against the effects of climate change, but actually giving them agency to solve it and also reap the economic benefits, I think it's the least as we in the global north can do, right? And thirdly, for a number of reasons, one of them being labor costs, another being just availability of space, it's going to be cheaper there. So just if we think of it in an economic paradigm, it makes a whole lot of sense to deploy massive amounts of carbon removal in the Global South. So if I had one bet, it would probably be that. The second bet is, again, not a pathway, but the bet is on EU policy, and especially the European trading system, which is by far the biggest compliance market in the world. And if there was a way for carbon removal to be integrated or connected, there's various options of doing that. That would be an absolute game changer. So again, not a direct answer to your question, but if I had bets or if I had resources to spend, I think I would spend them on these 2 elements, because they also then bring with themselves a lot of cascading positive effects for the complete space.
Let's touch both. Like first the South focus, and then it would be great to talk a little bit more about the voluntary market. That would be super interesting as well. Focusing on the South, the question with carbon removal technologies, and I think you raised it actually to me in the call we had before, and I thought it was such an interesting question. Who is actually customer of carbon removal and who is going to pay for it? And the South actually can pay for it. Or who is paying for it?
Who's paying for it? I think that's a connection to my previous company, actually, because I gave you the analogy of painkiller and vitamin. Right now, carbon removal is not a painkiller. It's a vitamin, right? It's nice that we have companies, especially the big tech companies, buying significantly, and this space wouldn't be closely where it is right now without them. But at the same time, if push comes to shove, all of these companies can do without, right? Their commitments to net zero are voluntary. Their procurement of carbon removal are voluntary. And right now it's a cost center for them. So if we think about it, there's no natural customer for carbon removal right now, because it doesn't necessarily solve a problem. And that's a problem for carbon removal companies, because if you're a startup, building a product that no one really needs right now is not a great position to be in. That being said, there are good reasons to buy carbon removal right now, and there need to be more going forward. We can think about various ways that can happen, right? Voluntary schemes like Science-Based Targets Initiative very, very recently came out with an update to their net zero plan, which includes carbon removal, not as much as the space would like to, but still. So if you're a company, a corporate that has made a net zero plan with Science-Based Target Initiative, you are now required to show or to buy carbon removal at your net zero date, only for scope 1, but still, it's something. So there is a quasi regulatory force. And I mentioned the ETS. Why? Because if the ETS, which is regulating a lot of industries in Europe, a lot of the highly emitting industries in Europe, if it forced them at the point where allowances have been reduced to an amount that you basically cannot emit anymore, to say, if you continue emitting, you need to buy carbon removal, ideally durable carbon removal. Well, then suddenly they have a problem and you have the solution. So you have a customer, right? Long term, if we think 10 gigatons in 2050, in my mind, there are very few scenarios where governments do not become the main buyer of carbon removal, right? So, and then to your question about the Global South, if it is already tricky to get customers, to get corporates to buy carbon removal in the Global North, where profits are high, and emissions for high tech for tech companies are low, it's even harder to do so in the Global South. Like we are working in India, for instance. There's no demand in India whatsoever for carbon removal, and it's understandable, right? They're at a completely
they don't
different
have the policies. They're
no
on a different
policies.
stage. Yeah.
If you think about where are they on their road to net zero, India has a goal in 2070. So it's 20 years further ahead. And they have bigger fish to fry, understandably, right? Both as a government, but also as corporates themselves in sustainability. Same goes for a lot of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where we also active. So for the time being, we are unfortunately reliant on a very few set of companies in the Global North that see it as their mandate, not because they need to, but because they have set themselves the mandate to buy carbon removal. And for some other companies who foresee already that it would make sense to become active now because they want to learn of how the space works. They want to establish connections with suppliers. They want to also make sure that internally their CFO understands what carbon removal is and why it occurs on his balance sheets at the end as a cost center.
But you just said, and I think that's very interesting, like you're focusing in the South, beside knowing that right now there is not much demand of it, that the governments might in future will have demand for it, but at the same time you're saying as well that the government probably won't be the buyers anymore in future. So it's you're betting actually on an industry which still needs to create it, where you don't know who is going to be the customer in the future.
To a degree, I think that's right. I think that's the bet that everyone is taking in the space. It's my fundamental hypothesis that I, for myself, deeply believe is valid. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this job. But also because if I think of a scenario where in 2050, we're not willing as a global community to pay for the 5 to 10 gigatons of carbon removal, I mean, we're in deep trouble. In deep trouble. So call it like optimism by my occupation, but it
needs to get solved.
I don't want exactly. I don't want to live in a scenario. Now the timeline question is a different one, which of course makes it difficult for, say, VC investors, because market risk is not something that they are very well equipped to take on, right?
And it looks such a long term as well. Horizon.
Exactly, right? It's a lot of policy and market risk. Are governments in the end going to really be paying for it? Is compliance integration going to happen in 3 years or in 5 years or in 8 years? That makes a whole lot of difference to a startup, to an investor with a fund timeline, but also to us and our atmosphere.
How do you see right now, like, thinking about a macro political changes right now with the Trump administration. Actually, the EU came out and to release some of the ESG reporting to make it not so complex, which I think is a good thing, that your bureaucracy is getting actually down. But is it the right way of doing it? So how do you see then that, 2001, 2002, there was this global ambition and such an enthusiasm about that topic, or in general, and now I think it has been cooling off a little bit. So I would like to know, how do you see carbon removal under the aspects of this changes? And at the same time, they came now, which I really love, like we always find new terms to it's like profitable sustainability.
Yes,
I really love that,
yes.
which should make sense that you create and bombard solutions which can actually be profitable and scalable, which makes sense, but maybe not in all aspects can do. So I would love to hear about, how do you see the changes in the political systems, which of course impacting a lot the climate world, and at the same time this drive to sustainable profitability. Is there a way of navigating this through?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of talk about it in carbon removal, but I think in climate tech in general, I think there was maybe in February, there's number of blog posts around climate tech is dead, right? Long live green growth, or long live purpose growth, or whatever we want to call it. There certainly have been times where there were more tailwinds for carbon removal and climate tech in general. In 2022 and 2023, it was rather easy to fundraise for startups. There also were IPO windows for green growth companies. Now this is changed significantly, which also has a direct impact on the business models that are valid or invalid. Back then, you could plan with a green premium. Why? Because the public equity markets were giving premiums to ESG. They valued ESG, and thus companies were willing to pay green premiums because it would up their ESG standards, if you will. Now, ESG is, while there's inflows into ESG funds, Nat Bullard's presentation showed that very clearly. It's less of a relevant topic, and I think it trickles down to the startups, into private equity markets, into VC markets, into startups as well. And into carbon removal very explicitly. Why? Because carbon removal, as we've discussed, is a product which doesn't have a natural customer. And if there's no natural customer that you can use to show traction or growth, then you're in for a bit of a tough ride. I think it is different for various carbon removal pathways, because some of them have clear benefits that you can also think about monetizing. So this is a lot of the work that we do at Remove, working with carbon removal startups, is trying to figure out, okay, what other revenue streams do you potentially have so that you're not too reliant on the voluntary carbon market or on credits in general. And for some cases, that's rather obvious and possible. And in others, it's really, really tricky. And
are you shifting your focus now more on the actual, how to create more sustainable, more revenue-based models in CDR in your accelerator? Or have you changed your conviction in your accelerator, or are you still doing the same, what you did 2020?
Oh, no, that would be negligent and stupid if we didn't change, right? If we didn't walk the talk that we preach to our startups, right? That obviously you need to do customer discovery, do market discovery, and if what you see doesn't align with where you're at, well, you need to pivot. And obviously, we've aligned with that as well, right? In 2020, 2023, 2022 is very much around, okay, how does your go-to-market to the voluntary carbon market look like? And now it's very much shifted to, okay, we say, the next couple of years are going to be survival mode. And how can we make sure you survive? And survival can have various, can look differently for different companies, but it almost always entails you needing to show some form of traction if you go down the VC route. And that traction is hardly going to be on the VCM. The VCM is very power law,
VCM?
Voluntary carbon market, so where the few buyers are, like the Microsofts and the Googles of this world.
That actually went quite down, no? Right? The whole size of the voluntary market.
Exactly, and especially in carbon removal, which is the more higher price side of things.
Yeah.
So, for us, it's like, okay, what are in your product, is there anything else that you can credibly sell to a customer where you solve a problem for them? And that can be selling a direct air capture unit to a greenhouse because they need CO2 for the growth of their plants. Now, is this carbon removal? No, it's not. Right? The CO2 is then emitted through the plants again by being consumed. But does that, for the time being, give you revenue and give you a customer that you can show to your investor? By the way, we sold 5 of these units. This is 200K in revenue or 2 million in revenue. Yeah, that's great. And we're not naive to then say, well, this is not carbon removal, so we're not going to suggest you do that or advise you on doing that. No. Right now it is about making your way through this trough that is happening. It just is there, and there's no way denying it.
So do you see for the next 5 years solutions which you think they're going to have more success?
I think the solutions that rely heavily on large amounts of equity capital, they'll struggle. It just is a fact, right? There's not a lot of public funding for it. And to make the next step in your company's trajectory, if you just rely on the next Series A round being a 15, 20 million round, it just has gotten a lot harder to raise that round. Now, if you are less capital intensive, or if you can have an easier route to generate other forms of revenue, then you're probably going to be better off. Think we can go enhanced weathering again, right? It has benefits for the soil, agronomic benefits for the soil. And in some parts of this world, currently the soil is being limed. So lime is being used and spread out to manage the soil pH. Basalt can do this as well. So if you can become at cost parity with that and deliver that basalt to achieve the same amount or even below that, and you can generate credits with that, I think you're in a good position.
It's like biochar as well.
Biochar as well. Very good case, because biochar has numerous outputs. They have obviously the carbon credits. They have the biochar, which can be used to soil amend as well. But they also have heat or electricity, which you can sell as well. Right? So the more diversification there is in your revenue streams, the better.
Okay. Is that the reason why you that's why Remove is actually a non-profit, because you're not heavily relying on the equity story?
I mean, we founded it at a time where things were still looking rosy, right? My girlfriend and I were both entrepreneurs, so we also understand the role of incentivization for entrepreneurs themselves and ourselves. So we're at that sort of a bit of a crossroads of deciding, okay, is this going to be a for-profit or a non-profit entity? And there are good examples of for-profit accelerators, Y Combinator, Techstars, right? There weren't a lot non-profit accelerators out there. But for us, it was clear we wanted to always put impact first. And then if you looked at it, we would need to compromise a lot on impact if we decided to go the for-profit route. So for instance, why do accelerators or in general VC funds work? Because they can do follow-on investments, right, on their winners. Now, if we now said we're going to support 40 startups a year, all of them will get a 50K check, a safe note, and then we'll only select the 5 or 8 best ones to do a follow-on investment. Now, this also signals to the whole space that the other 35 that Remove has worked with for 6 months don't merit an investment. That's horrible, right? We didn't want to give out that signal to the space. So that was already problem 1. Problem 2 was we support these startups so early that probably time to exit is at times 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 years. And that just doesn't align with the fund timeline. So there were these 2 clear elements that would say, okay, we would need to compromise on impact by either sending this wrong signal or selecting companies that are not in the earliest stages because it doesn't fit our timeline. So we said, hey, we're not going to do that. So we're going to go the nonprofit route.
How difficult is it to get financing for such a structure?
It was interesting. We had, of course, had conversation in both directions back then.
Yeah.
And as soon as we started nonprofit, it became easier. This might have been selection bias because we already had spoken to more impact-minded folks. But it's still not easy. Philanthropic fundraising is different from equity fundraising in that in equity fundraising, there's a very clear transaction, right? I have parts of my company and you have investment that you want to give me. And the sort of realm of opportunities or options or things that such a transaction can look like is very much clear. We can haggle about valuation, we can haggle around whether you get a discount, et cetera, et cetera. In philanthropic fundraising, it's until I understand what actually my value proposition to you as a potential funder is, I need to have like 3-4 conversations with you. Because sometimes you have a very clear impact strategy that we either fit in or not. Sometimes, and luckily, all the people that we are working with, they are very much impact minded and they have a clear idea. But you also speak to people that just want a cool story in the country club, right? And that conversation is, of course, a very different one. So it's a challenge.
Do you need to fundraise every year?
Yeah, really, I think we don't think as startups think in funding rounds.
Yeah.
It really is always be fundraising. That's kind of the motto that you're in. Because of course, also depending on your ability to fundraise, there's no shortage of things that we could tackle, right? We have a very, very long list of things that we believe are systemically relevant in carbon removal that we want to tackle. But of course, it all requires resources. Luckily, we really had been fortunate to work with a bunch of funders that have been the most supportive in that. I couldn't have imagined anyone else to fund that. But yeah, also right now, talking about the macroclimate, we sense it as well in fundraising, right?
I just wanted to say, how is it now as a non-profit?
If you've seen, for instance, what happened to Breakthrough Energy, which is the foundation that Bill Gates has been funding, as a fallout of the U.S. leaving the WHO, Gates has said, well, actually, there's people dying right now because of that exit from the U.S. So they stepped in because Gates has traditionally been someone coming out of health. But of course, he then also needs to relocate resources, which has meant Breakthrough Energy, which has been a big player in climate, has a bit receded from climate.
Didn't know that.
Which of course is understandable, but it's not great for climate. And there I think is a bit of a trickle down happening on some of the philanthropic ends, which in my mind is understandably, but at the same time, this is the time to actually double down on this because this is the time where a lot of organizations, be them for-profit or non-profit, are going to be struggling.
Have you ever thought about fundraising and giving out carbon credits yourself?
Has never been an element because it would misalign incentives, right? If we support these startups and potentially get them to their first credits and have a role in that, we shouldn't be the ones profiting from the number of credits that they sell. That is actually how we've gotten to where we are in the voluntary carbon market in the avoidance credit days. So that is not carbon removal. If you think about the carbon math, it's not 1 minus 1. That is, you still have an emission, but you pay someone else not to emit. So it's 1 minus 0. You still end up with 1 emission in the atmosphere. And the incentives were misaligned. And study after study shows that not all, they're good projects, but quite a number of the projects, actually a majority of the projects, did not end up delivering the climate impact. And one reason was because incentives were misaligned.
Okay, interesting. So how does your accelerator program work? If you are in the, if you have a startup and you want to do something, like how can you apply? What do you offer?
Yeah, we have a program in Europe. We have one in India, and with a few partners, we also have one in Africa. And if you're a carbon removal startup, regardless of which path you are in, and if you are early, but we have had teams from pre-seed to seed, even Series A in our program, so it's quite diverse. You can apply. You need to make sure you're carbon removal, and then we'll have a look at you. And there's we do this in cohorts, so it's not a rolling program. We do this in cohorts, and we typically have 2 stages. We call one foundations, which is we work with you for 10 weeks, really about the basics of both carbon removal and about the sort of entrepreneurship basics. And then there is a cutoff where you need to pitch in order to progress to the next stage. And that is then called LEAP. And then the support is a bit more intense. And we go down from 20 down to 8. And that is then about 4.5 months of support. That support is 1, expert sessions where we bring in people from the ecosystem to have a one-to-many conversation And that can be potential buyers. So we have people from the Frontier group, which is the buyer group that Google or Alphabet is part of, for instance, or McKinsey. We have people talking about policy. We have people talking about life cycle assessment for carbon removal. We have people talking about verification and measurement, which we also briefly touched on. And also on the entrepreneurship side, fundraising, finances, startup finances.
How many are going through like in a year through your process?
So we have... In Europe, up until now, we have done 40 per year in 2 cohorts. Now that we've ventured more into the Global South, we're doing 20 per year in Europe, 20 per year in India, and 10 to 20 in Africa. That depends a bit on the timeline.
So a little bit more than...
Exactly. Yeah. And then the second part is really one-on-one coaching. My co-founder and I have both been entrepreneurs. We sit down with you and we address whatever challenge you might have every second week. And that can be everything from, hell, I need to fire my first employee. How do I make sure this is not as horrible as I think it is, to I have 3 potential buyers for these credits. Who should I sell to and how should I price? So really a wide variety. We also provide a bit of grant funding, non-dilutive funding, that we hope can get you, for instance, to be able to rent lab space for 2 months. That then allows you to make tests. With the results, you can go fundraising. So it's not a lot of grant funding, but we still believe like these tiny amounts can make a difference in certain selective moments in a startup.
Can you share a funny or inspiring story out of these coaching sessions?
Inspiring more than funny. We always have fun. That's clear. Because, it takes some... Really funny and inspiring are actually connected. It takes some craziness to become a startup founder in general. You know this. Right, you need to be you need to be a bit crazy,
a little bit nuts, yeah.
Yeah. Then building something in climate, which is even more harder, and then building something in carbon removal. Yet again, you need to be quite nuts, right? So it draws a certain kind of people, which I love to work with. Right? These are people that are in there because of the impact, and that regardless of whatever tailwinds, headwinds they might face, whatever setbacks they might face, they just maintain this fundamental belief that this is the right thing that they're doing, this conviction. And I leave these conversations more often than not with a fundamental conviction that we're going to do this because all of these entrepreneurs are in it with their hearts and not just with their minds looking for the next quick exit.
When looking back, since you built Remove, when you said it already has been some changes in that, do you see any setback, what you experience, which you learned a lot about?
I think coming out of, it's less of a setback, but I think a challenge. Coming out of the first fundraise, which was during the time where carbon removal just got started and there was a bit of hype around it. I think we might have been a bit naive or guided too much by the success we had back then. To then go into our next fundraising to realize, okay, actually fundraising philanthropic money is friggin' hard. So I think that was a bit of a sobering time we had.
Any tips if someone else wants to do that?
Typically in a nonprofit, you have 2 cost centers. One is just the base load expense that keeps the engine running, and the other one are the projects. The base load is the tougher to fundraise for. Why? Because it's just not sexy, right? If you tell a funder, we need 200K per year.
To do admin.
Exactly, right? To do admin and, I don't know, we're a remote team, but to also pay for the rent of our offices and, I don't know, to pay our accountant. It's just not sexy. So the tip is, I think, to reduce that bit as much as possible or hide it in the projects themselves, because the projects are exciting, right? If you have something new and you can tell a funder, without you, this project is not going to happen, which is oftentimes really true, right? It's not going to happen if it wasn't for that funder. That's exciting. And that's also exciting for the funder because they can then go and
something
tell
tangible.
whoever, exactly. They can say, see this India project? Wouldn't have happened without me or without us. Right?
Ah, interesting. Okay. So coming now, thinking about 2050, what we just touched before, like you want to achieve net zero. And we touched it before, you said 10 gigatons needs to be removed. And one of another person I had on my podcast, she said that's round about the size of the oil and gas industry currently, what kind of investments we actually need in infrastructure and the whole structure, which is crazy if you think about it. And this is like, it's not like 100 years, it's quite close. So do you see any turning point? Like, let's go to 2050, would look back. Do you see any turning point where you see like, okay, this is when we would make it?
Yeah, it's a daunting perspective, right? And I agree with it, by the way. If you just do the quick math, 10 gigatons at $100 per ton, that's $1 trillion market. I think oil and gas has like 2.5 trillion. It's roughly that size. And we know it's going to be a lot of physical infrastructure. We're not building SaaS. I think the turning point would probably be, I mentioned it before, but I'm mentioning it because it would really be the absolute game changer. Compliance. So if companies were, by compliance regime, forced to buy carbon removal, the market pull would be so strong that financing would follow suit, deployment would follow suit, infrastructure deployment would follow suit as well. And we just need to make sure, and this is kind of the work that we are doing, that once that happens, the generation of startups is there, because they're not going to be there with a snap of a finger, right? Building a startup, let alone a deep tech startup or climate startup, is hard and it takes time. So if this generation of startups don't make it until, let's say, 2030, let's just say that as a goal where this integration and compliance happens, and we start from scratch with a new generation of startups, that's just 20 years until 2050. The growth curves are so steep, I would have doubts that we would make it.
That's a little bit daunting.
It is very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it, it fits actually well to your book, Race to Zero, like you co-authored that book. If you think about it now, I don't know, when did you write it?
Last year. So the German version came out last year and the English version now this year.
Okay. Is there anything you would change now, like after a year in that book?
In that book? No, I wouldn't. I think everything we write in there still holds true. So it's a book essentially written for sustainability professionals that have not had a proper sort of introduction to carbon removal, that maybe have been tasked to set a net zero goal, and they're now asking themselves, okay, we have residual emissions, what do we do with that? And that might have had their last interaction with chemistry, biology, physics, let alone a combination of that like in 10th grade, right? So we wrote it in a way that's quite low barrier of entry, working with like a lot of metaphors. It has a bit of I dare say, like literary aspiration in there as well. So no, I think I'm really happy with what Ben and I put together here, and the feedback for the German one has been very, very positive, which is also been the reason why we've now turned it into an English version as well. I wish that, I think there's some wishful or hope. There's certainly a lot of hope in there, which I wouldn't change, but it's something I think to acknowledge as well, because especially if we think about what happened between last year and this year. There hasn't been a lot of evidence for that hope to become true yet. Let me put it like that.
You still need a lot of conviction
yes.
to actually go there. I really like that. Is conviction and hope would you give to your younger self? Or is there anything else you would tell your younger self, the basketball player?
Although I think it's always been there, to be fair. Like, I have a fundamental trust in life, both in my journey, but also just in general, which has also then probably led me to work in entrepreneurship and work in impact. So I guess I would just say, trust the process, right? Which I think is true for a lot of things. Or change the process if we don't like it. But actually, up until now, of course, like to a degree, on a systems level, we also need to change the system. So maybe just going along with it is not right. And actually, that's also what your work is doing, what my work is doing as well, is changing the system. But I think for yourself on the journey that you're at, I would just say,
trust yourself, kind of.
Yeah, trust yourself. I think the values that you have developed, that you've been instilled with, if you're aware of them and if you're happy with them, just, try to live by them.
Nice. if you could leave our listeners with one takeaway, something to think about long after this interview, what would it be?
I think the fact that you're listening to this means you've been infected by sort of the climate bug as well. And I think there's no unseeing it and there's no unfeeling it. So yeah, trust the process on that as well. We need you, and we need a lot more of you in this space. It might seem daunting at first, especially if you're not a climate scientist or engineer. But if you think about the size of this industry, carbon removal and climate in general, it will need every skill set you can imagine. You're a lawyer, we will need lawyers. You're an accountant, we will need accountants. You're a craftsman, we will need people that craft these infrastructures. We need all hands on deck. And I think this is the most worthwhile pursuit and purpose that I can imagine for my career, and I can imagine for a lot of people as well.
You got me goosebumps here. Amazing. Like, I really loved our conversations. I probably have like thousands more questions, but how can people reach out to you if you want to know more about Remove, or maybe even apply, or maybe even donate?
Yeah, all of the above. Very happy to. You can find more on remove.global if you just want to get an idea of what we do. Easiest is probably to reach out to me on LinkedIn or Marian at remove.global as well. Always happy to chat. If you're inclined to speak to me, that's already a very good filter. You have understood why it needs carbon removal and that you're looking for your role in that. I'm happy to help you find it.
Great. Thank you so much for joining my first video podcast. How did it feel?
Well, thanks for having me. It was awesome. It's we're a remote team. I appreciate working digitally, but this is just a different quality.
Yes.
Right? So I really appreciate it. This was also my first video one. And maybe as now, I don't know, do you have a title song? If not, we can play some techno.
Exactly. That would be actually good. That should be our outro.
Let's do that.
So thank you so much for joining. It was absolutely a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can find show notes, background materials, and guest details on our website, sustainnow.ch. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Got an idea for a future episode or an interesting solution we should explore? Let us know in the comments or visit sustainnow.ch. See you in the next episode.